Good morning, everyone. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, with which I affiliated while I conducted research for my dissertation here last academic year, or for a part of the academic year. Thanks also to Dr. Gabrielle Hossein, who encouraged me to present on my in-progress dissertation in this venue, and to Ms. Patricia Hackett, Ms. Deborah McPhee, and Ms. Catherine Chan for scheduling and organizing this seminar. So you heard a bit about my dissertation in the introduction, and so today in this talk I'll be examining the second site in my project, the early 20th century barrack yard as narrated in the Beacon Group literatures and as described in British West Indian housing and social welfare policy. I begin with the Beacon Group, a transnational Trinidadian literary collective whose members included C.L.R. James, Alfred Mendez, Albert Gomez, and Cia Tomasos. The collective was so named for the Beacon, the magazine they founded and published from March 1931 to November 1933, which struck at British colonialism, the church, racism, and middle-class respectability through short stories and nonfiction writing. Drawing on working-class life in Port of Spain, they penned what would come to be known as barrack yard fiction, novels and short stories that centered on the yards and buildings divided into rented rooms in which the working people of the city lived. Though short-lived, the Beacon and its writings narrated the conditions of the late colonial period in the British West Indies. While the Beacon Group has been heralded as an anti-colonial collective that bridged fiction and politics, their barrack yard literatures resemble, I argue, the point of view of local and regional housing and social welfare bodies. In particular, the third-person limited point of view that the Beacon Group writers employed in their short fiction spoke to a literate, middle-class, respectable audience who were introduced to the barrack yard and the everyday lives of working-class people. In the yard dwelt poverty, sex, and violence in this view. Similarly, government bodies such as the Planning and Housing Commission of Trinidad and Tobago and social welfare institutions sought to correct these circumstances through plans for some slum clearing and new housing settlements, as well as assessments of the values and prospects of barrack yard residents. Just as the administrator diagnosed social ills from afar, so too did the Beacon Group writers when describing the alien life of the barrack yards. In this way, both the policy paper and the short story inaugurate a colonial masculine writing subject. And if these texts reflect colonial masculinity in the late colonial British West Indies through speakers that are persuasive and full of concern, the object of their concern lived to excess. Many of the short stories centered on kept women or sweet men who had sexual relationships with traditionally employed men or women in exchange for money, rent, food, or clothes. As a form of unplanned housing in which its residents engage in these sorts of relationships, the yard is a part of the informal sector. I also connect these social relationships with the kind of unplanned informal composition of the barrack yard as built form composed of corrugated iron and scrap lumber. The distance narrator in the barrack yard literatures, like housing policy and studies, present the barrack yard as a planning and social problem to be solved. In this chapter, I will first offer definitions of the yard through policy papers and studies of housing in the British West Indies in the 20th century. Then I will delve into the Beacon and the Beacon Group writers. In order to understand the yard as a site of sexual exchange, I will examine the connections between form and subsistence economies in West Indian literature. And finally, I will bring these insights to readings of C.L.R. James's short story, Triumph, and Cia Tomasos' short story, The Dogla. In Trinidad, the Public Health Ordinance of 1917 defined the barrack yard as, quote, any building or collection of buildings divided into rooms, occupied singly or in sets by persons of the poorer classes, and to which there are a common barrack yard and common conveniences, end quote. Informal settlements do not simply sit beside or inside the administrative and historical centers of these cities throughout the British West Indies in which yards proliferated, not just Trinidad. Rather, they are the underside of the grandeur of colonial architecture and planning. The barrack yard, known variously as a yard, tenant yard, and tenement yard in other parts of the region, answered the need for housing in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the British West Indies. Sugar had declined in the decades following emancipation, and the colonial state began to turn its eye onto the settlements that working people, descendants of enslaved Africans and indentured Indian laborers, founded in and around West Indian towns and cities. For example, migrants to Kingston, Jamaica in the post-emancipation period came from a variety of places. African higglers, or street vendors from St. Mary and St. Catherine parishes, and formerly indentured Indians from the cane fields in St. Catherine's parish. In Trinidad, the migrants to East Dry River and Laventille squatted on crown lands or on those of private owners, buying plots from owners on which they built houses and tended private gardens. In the 1870s, there was a shift of construction from the long, low rows of buildings or military-style barracks, which were gradually replaced by the estate-type barrack yard, in which rooms or buildings were arranged around common space. The East Dry River district had more of the former, while the downtown Port of Spain area had the latter. The City Council's medical officer of health wrote in a 1928 report that at that time, the old barrack yards in Port of Spain numbered 2,900 with 36,000 occupants, nearly half the city's population. Urban populations in the British West Indies grew rapidly at this point in time, but population growth was not accompanied by proportionate economic growth. Accordingly, throughout the British West Indies, policymakers and researchers alike sought to diagnose and remedy the ills of the yard in the decades before independence, as housing such as the yard began to deteriorate and social welfare organizations attempted to meet the needs of working class people. For example, in 1951, P.H.J. Lamp, then the Executive Secretary of Public Health in the Caribbean, the British Caribbean, contributed a report titled Housing and Health in the Caribbean to a much larger policy publication titled Aspects of Housing in the Caribbean. This publication was produced from a British West Indian Conference on Housing Policy, which followed debate on the subject in the Legislative Council in Trinidad. The Caribbean Commission, in conversation with the Research Council, agreed to this regional meeting. And Lamp here states his concerns about overcrowding and the communicable diseases that spread as a result. Quote, "The city slum in particular is a breeding ground of venereal disease, illegitimacy, prostitution, criminality, and lack of moral restraint." He goes on to argue that the so-called social diseases, while important, have very little to do with regional housing policy. These social welfare issues were usually the domain of church-affiliated organizations, which, as Rhoda Reddick writes, encouraged nuclear family structures among working-class people. However, the unplanned form of the barrack yard and kept relationships are interlinked parts of working-class life that the Beacon Group focus on in their fiction. Another example from 1975, in which Erna Brauber conducted a study of yards in Kingston, Jamaica, in which the communal dwelling is known simply as yard. She argues that the yard is not simply a physical dwelling, but also a social space. In this setting and at this time, the two most popular forms of the yard are the government yard and the tenant yard. Structurally, the government yard is a long building, similar to the military barracks, usually one story and made up of standard units. And the state owns and rents rooms in these sorts of yards. In contrast, the tenant yard is a much more informal dwelling, in which each household has their own fireplace for cooking and washing outside their small units, and residents share other amenities, similar to the newer style of barrack yards found in Trinidad. According to Brauber, residents of government yards aspire to middle-class life, while tenant yard residents choose not to, and these choices impact social life in each type of yard. For example, tenant yard residents socialize with and confide in one another. A woman and mother, one of Brauber's respondents, noted, quote, "Someone to talk to makes life possible," end quote. The yard dwellers also engaged in sexual relationships with other residents, and scholars such as Kamal Kempadu and Gloria Wecker have written extensively on the diversity of Caribbean sexualities, including multiple partnering relationships and transactional sex. For example, in Mr. Rob's yard, the landlord has children with one of the yard's residents and feels equal to all of his residents, though they pay him money for the privilege of living in his property. For this reason, Brobert refers to this type of tenant yard as a communal yard. Women often have men who visit with them, paying rent, buying clothes and food, and according to Brobert, women will often treat their male partners with deference and are quiet in their presence, but once men depart the yard, women feel free to speak and act freely in their friendships with other women. More to the point, women will court other men and dance with them at local events. One of the examples, quote, Bev, a young woman who lives partially in one of our communal yards, is obliged to a steady visitor, but will establish an intimate relationship with any male whom she fancies and who is less economically depressed than her steady mate, end quote. In this way, the barrack yard is out of joint with standards of bourgeois respectability. As I opened, the Beacon Group was a literary collective whose literary journal, The Beacon, published 28 issues from 1931 to 1933. Harvey Neptune argues that the Beacon served as the critical domain in which Trinidadian writers and essayists began to imagine a national identity. Their objects of critique were Englishness, white supremacy, and imperialism, among others. And occasionally these critiques did include challenges to prevailing ideas about respectability and gender, such as their endorsement of the divorce bill. The Beacon Group published a number of short stories centered on the barrack yard and the Beacon. However, they portrayed the setting as alien and thought about sexual relationships, including kept relationships, as simply a kind of counterpoint to nuclear family structures and respectability. In this talk, I want to focus instead on informal economies that are based on sexual exchange. Though they often went to live in Port of Spain barrack yards, they, as Reinhard Sander writes, quote, remains merely sympathetic observers of an unusual way of life, end quote. In Triumph, as well as in his only novel, Minty Alley, C.L.R. James expresses the distance between middle-class writers and their subjects through form, specifically a limited narrator. Hazel Carby examines this distance in her essay, Proletarian or Revolutionary Literature, writing that, quote, James reproduces the painstaking details of poverty, but with an unmistakable distancing of tone, if not of sympathy, end quote. In other words, while distance was a matter of form, it was also a matter of politics. And the stories highlighted in red are the ones that I will be focusing on today. In contrast to the distanced male narrator, attention to the kept woman or sweet man yields insight on sexual labor and exchange in this time and place. This sort of analysis, upending third-person limited point of view, follows the insights of two bodies of literature. First, feminist literary criticism has long challenged male-centered narrative authority, and feminist theory has considered domestic work through Marxist categories of labor. In addition, cultural materialism emphasizes how we might understand expressive forms from the perspective of working people. And placing these bodies of literature in conversation allows me to examine the sexual labor of men and women as central to the informal sector. A cultural materialist reading of the Beacon Group literatures is not unprecedented. As I referred to her earlier, Hazel Carby writes the Beacon Group into the genre of proletarian literature. James and his counterparts produced work that not only resonated with the new Negro Renaissance, but also with proletarian writing in Soviet Russia. Revolutionary literature proposes that writers critique the bourgeoisie and capital through bourgeois cultural forms. In contrast to literature that took empire, racial, and class oppression for granted, the Beacon Group was part of a broader Black literary internationalism that pointed to the issues of the day, most notably decolonization and labor. In writing around these central questions, the Beacon Group penned short stories that fit the conventions of the form as brief and coherent. In a reading of C.L.R. James's novel Minty Alley, Carby draws our attention to the protagonist, Mr. Haynes, who's a young middle-class Black man renting a room after the death of his mother. At number 2 Minty Alley, Mr. Haynes first observes his neighbors through a crack in the walls, but soon finds himself mired in the tensions and romance of the space. In this view, the literary depiction of the barrack yard in working class life is simply a counterpoint to bourgeois values. However, this narrative approach reduces working class life to an instrument with which Marxist writers might dismantle class oppression. Additionally, it focuses exclusively on the middle class protagonist and his outsider's experience of the yard. While the permanent residents at Minty Alley are known by their given names, for example, Mr. Haynes is known by a gendered title and a surname. The short fiction on which I focus in this talk, apart from form, differ from Minty Alley in one important way. There's no middle-class protagonist to mediate our reading of the yard. Instead, the narrator directly depicts the events of the yard with little insight into the motivations of its permanent residents. How might we overcome the relationship between the middle-class writer and the yard as a strange art object? In contrast, my readings of Beacon Group's short stories focus on the characters who drive the plot forward, the kept women of the barrack yard. Traditional subsistence economies, such as farming and fishing, which date to the plot system during and after slavery, I add the sexual exchange at the heart of kept relationships. The barrack yard dwellers engage in sexual rivalry and drink, but these behaviors do not simply distinguish them from their prudish middle-class counterparts. Instead, sex and revelry are part of a mode of exchange between traditionally or self-employed men and women in the barrack yard. The yard and the room are sites of sexual labor, and I reframe to the barrack yard literatures to understand the barrack yard as a space with its own logics and economies. Because the barrack yard is composed of scrap materials such as corrugated iron and lumber, and its residents subsist in part through kept relationships, I argue that it is part of the informal sector. In her writings about the short story Sweet Man, Leah Rosenberg argues that sweet men are not unlike capitalists who profit from the exploitation of workers, in this particular case, traditionally employed women. However, I argue that the women and men who keep working class people are earning more than they need to subsist and continue to work, more than what Marx calls the only necessary wage rate. These traditionally employed people then use the wages left over to keep a woman or man, giving them clothes or food or paying their rent. In this way, the participants in a kept relationship are collaborating under capital, and the person who keeps, I argue, kind of reroutes their wages. And so this is an argument that I expand in the larger chapter where I think about excess beyond the only necessary wage rate. Still, theorists and scholars of capitalism, such as Michael Denning, have dated the informal sector to the 1970s in the so-called Third World, to Africa and the Caribbean. If migrations to towns and cities and the decline of industry mark the informal sector, then we might move the timeline back to the post-emancipation period, in which the first large numbers of workers moved from the estates to the hills outside of and the yards of British West Indian cities. And if we see this informality in particular through the short story, how are literary formed and subsistence economies linked? Sylvia Wynter writes of the Caribbean novel in conversation with the plot system in The Plantation. If the Caribbean is paradigmatic site of the plantation and the novel form arises from the market, then the novel and the Caribbean are linked by production, exchange, and capital. Wynter goes on to argue that the novel expresses the tension between use value and exchange value between the plot and the plantation systems. And while I'm discussing short fiction here and not the novel, I'm following Kenneth Ramchand here, who writes that the tradition of short story writing in the West Indies has greatly influenced the novel form, and in that way we might extend Wynter's argument about production and form to find subsistence in the short story as well. And now to my readings. In both Triumph and the Dogla, the third-person limited narrator follows a woman in a Port of Spain barrack yard as she mourns a lost relationship and attempts to win her man back. While at first it appears that the woman is simply mourning lost love, it becomes clear that she is managing resources in attempting to recover her relationship. In C.L.R. James's 1929 short story Triumph, the narrator opens by attempting to define the West Indian barrack yard. Where people in England and America say slums, Trinidadians say barrack yards. Probably the word is a relic of the days when England relied as much on garrisons of soldiers as on her fleet to protect her valuable sugar-producing colonies, end quote. The narrator poses an analogy or taxonomy. The thing known in England and the United States as one thing must necessarily take a different name in the West Indies because the barrack yard grew out of militarism and empire. He continues by describing the barrack yard as a surveyor would, with exact measurements and yet from a distance. Quote, "Every street in Port of Spain proper can show you numerous examples of the type. A narrow gateway leading into a fairly big yard, on either side of which run long, low buildings consisting of anything from 4 to 18 rooms, each about 12 feet square. It is a complex space and no two seem to be quite alike. While the narrator zooms in to tell a brief story in a particular barrack yard, he does not give us the particular dimensions or features of this yard. First, C.L.R. James's Triumph, published in 1929, centers on Mamets, who had once been the, quote, most prosperous woman in the yard, but the tram conductor who had been keeping her, believing she was unfaithful, had beaten and left her. Without the $3 the conductor gave Mamets weekly, she is in danger of being evicted from her room. We first find the central character of Triumph Mamets in her room on Abercrombie Street in downtown Port of Spain. On the wall hanging are, quote, 3 full-page pictures torn from illustrated periodicals, photographs of Lindbergh, Bernard Shaw, and Sargent's Portrait of a Woman, end quote. The room is otherwise bare and squalid, befitting Mamets' condition and mood after her conductor leaves her. The presence of these particular images seem incidental to the plot as images that convey a distant, brighter side of life that contrast with the description of the barrack yard. These photographs represent, respectively, of course, an American aviator, a British playwright, and a portrait by an American painter who exhibited in transatlantic salons. By drawing our attention to these images, James places these sketches of barrack yard life in conversation with contemporaneous technology as well as arts that used and challenged realism. The everyday practices of the yard's residents, descendants of enslaved Africans and Indian coolie laborers, are as critical to the space as the circulation of mass culture between the United States, Britain, and Trinidad. The opening pages of Triumph move swiftly from description to reflection. Quote, "No longer do the barrack yarders live the picturesque life of 25 years ago," end quote. Port of Spain, and particularly Laventille, the dense hilly settlement that overlooks the city, are well known as the birth of steel pan, but police began to surveil the yards and to curtail the residents' creative practices. Quote, "All carnival practice must cease at 10 o'clock. The policeman is to the stick fighter as the sanitary inspector to the larvae. At night, the streets are bright with electric light. The arm of the law is longer, its grip stronger," end quote. And while many yards were eventually targeted for demolition, there are everyday practices that the policeman or surveyor's eye cannot capture. Mamets and her neighbor Celestine take steps to correct her situation. Mamets is, quote, a black woman, too black to be pure Negro, probably with some Madrasi East Indian blood in her, a suspicion which was made a certainty by the long, thick plaits of her plentiful hair, end quote. The combination of these features, her build and her stylish manner of dress, makes her attractive to men, and this description illustrates the racial and ethnic hierarchy at play in Caribbean sex work. She was not born in Trinidad, but rather Demerara, a county of then British Guyana. Like other West Indians in the early 20th century, she traveled beyond the colony of her birth for work. She does not have any friends or family in Trinidad beyond the yard and faces eviction if she cannot pay her rent. Only Celestine, with whom Mamets was generous during better days, will show her kindness. Still, Celestine has her own obligations to the man who keeps her. He is a policeman named Jimmy who visits often and sets down rules for Celestine. Quote, "He believed in discipline. He wasn't going to find himself mixed up in court as a keeper of any brawling woman," end quote. So Celestine cannot take Mamets into her home and must find means other than fighting to help Mamets. Celestine believes that Irene, another resident of the yard, has been jealous of Mamets' good favor with men and has set a spirit on Mamets. When Jimmy is away, Celestine is free, as Erna Brauber writes about yards in Jamaica and women and women's friendships, to pray for and bathe Mehmet's to remove the spirit. The narrator remarked earlier that the arm of the law is longer, its grip stronger. In light of the visiting relationship between a resident of this yard in Triumph and a policeman, we might say the arm of the yard reaches into the arm of the law reaches into the yard to caress as well as to grip. In other words, surveillance is tied up with and complicated through intimacy and intimate work. In Triumph, descriptions of the women of the yard distinguish between legitimate work and leisure. Irene had to do washing to help her out. Quote, Irene had to do washing to help her out, while Mehmet and Celestine did nothing, merely cooked and washed clothes for their men, end quote. However, Mehmet rejects marriage, calling it exploitation, saying that if she were to get married, she would be a perfect slave, saying, I all right as I be. Mehmet, in fact, is all right by the end. She soon has two relationships, one with a man named Popo who pays her rent, and with a butcher, Nicholas, who gives her free meat. Seeking to thwart her, on Easter, Irene goes to tell the butcher that Mehmet and Popo are spending the day together, and Nicholas flies into a rage. Celestine lies to help Mehmet, saying that Popo was never there. And then comes the ironic resolution that Peter Ayres argues is a central characteristic of the Beacon Group's fiction. Irene must watch as Nicholas begs for Mehmet's forgiveness and continues to support her, his first gift totaling $50. Sorry, I've been forgetting to drink water. In the Dogla, the opening description is linked to capitalist time. On a free Saturday evening after the regimented work week and before Sunday morning worship, the barrack yard is described not in exact dimensions, but rather with affect. Quote, the atmosphere was heavy, stuffy, intoxicated, end quote. The phrase, it was Saturday, repeats. The yard is not static, but rather changes with the day. Saturday is the day when the men receive their paychecks. In contrast, the barrack yard is typically depressing and its inhabitants tired. However, if we understand the barrack yard simply through its residents' dependence on traditional work and capital from Monday to Friday, we neglect the informal exchanges that sustain the yard otherwise. The auxiliary verb must describes these the indulgences and pleasures in which the barrack yard residences partake as obligations equal to those of the work week. Quote, once a week, the tired men and women must indulge in the bacchanalian propensities of the barrack yard. The men do not stay at home. They must meet their friends to take a drink or two. But while the men are away, the women are not lonely. This is a mutual arrangement that allows both parties to have their freedom. More to the point, in the absence of men, the space is centered on women's social lives in companionship as well as in rivalry. The scents of rum and cooking onions saturate the yard's air. The residents are drinking rum and cooking. Two stray animals illustrate the abundance and lack in the yard. The cat feeds on the waste of the feast, while there is not enough for the dog to eat. The introduction continues, quote, the women unreservedly displayed their dishes. While at first glance this suggests rivalry, the description of the yard space points to a more complex relationship. As an open-air space, they can see one another and they're using their kitchen implements outside, and because to the pungent smell of the onions hung about the rooms, the doors to the room are open to the yard. The reference to bacchanalia variously harkens to Greek antiquity as well as Caribbean parlance, and though C.L.R. James, Tomosos's contemporary, discussed ancient Greece as a source of Caribbean modernity, there are differences between classical and 20th century British West Indian revelry apparent in the phrasing here. It points to other roots of modernity. The men and women drink rum instead of wine, which recalls the sugarcane plantations of the 18th and 19th centuries throughout the region. And the revelers consume a refined product of the product that their forebears harvested and processed. Elaine, the kept woman in this story, intentionally moves about the yard's sexual economy using sentiment to not lure, but to kind of entice potential suitors. In other words, Elaine is performing sex work as she courts Tony and other men about the yard. And Kamala Kempadu writes of the post-emancipation period in the British West Indies. So I'm arguing that the yard kind of follows the post-emancipation period in which, quote, women established autonomous work from the plantations and gendered relations were transformed under changing relations of production, end quote. Before Elaine enters the narrative, the narrator introduces two neighbors, Keturah and Anna. Remarks on color and body shape overwhelm their descriptions. Keturah is, quote, black and plump, features that are pleasing to her man. And though her man, a meat vendor, drinks heavily and comes and goes freely, Keturah does not ask him to behave differently or to spend more time in the yard. She seems to enjoy the freedom that visiting relationships afford. Anna, a slim, quote, slim brown woman of Spanish descent, quote, end quote, once lived with a Chinese man who is now in prison. So Elaine is not the only woman in the yard who engages in visiting relationships. Her neighbors draw on their experiences to discuss Elaine's own suspended relationship with Tony. While the title of the story, The Douglas, suggests that Elaine is the central character, she does not enter the narrative at the beginning. Instead, Elaine enters following the introduction to the yard and its Saturday evening activity where Keturah and Anna gossip. As with the neighbors, phenotype is central to Elaine's description. Quote, she was an Afro-Indian, what is known as a Dogla. She was black and elegant. All men liked her company. She was always merry, always laughing at the top of her voice. She was feline and vicious, end quote. The passage begins with her racial background, and her race and personality traits are entangled in this series of short declarative sentences. At the center of the passage is the statement that men enjoyed socializing with her, which places this description in the context of male desire. These declarations suggest that Elaine's suitors admire her both because she is easygoing and because they can easily decipher her behavior. She is knowable. Accordingly, this passage has equally simple syntax. Most sentences begin with she was and end with an adjective or two. The contrast, however, between her merry disposition most of the time and her, quote, feline and vicious ways makes clear that Elaine is more complex and, in fact, in charge of the relationships that she engages in. Elaine understands the desires of her admirers and the way that they project them onto her body and performs a set of personality traits in response. In this way, her elegance and merriment are not essential characteristics, but rather a kind of uniform that she dons for the work of visiting or kept relationships. The terms of Elaine's engagement with her suitors comes into sharper relief in another passage. She meets all of her dates at a local Chinese restaurant where, while it is not stated, the men pay for her meals. At this point in the story, all of the men remain unnamed. The suitors become an indistinguishable mass, referred to as they. Quote, they all said that they loved her, she liked to hear them say it, and made a great many promises and accepted all of their presents. Elaine possessed a grace that intoxicated them. Her seductive charm drove some mad. They all admired her exuberance of spirit. They all called her the Dogla, end quote. The use of anaphora in the previous passage continues here with the noun phrase they all beginning several statements in the present passage. On these dates, the men give Elaine loving words and presents, and Elaine makes undisclosed promises to her dates in return. Perhaps she promises to enter an exclusive relationship with him or simply to begin a sexual relationship with him, because these passages only suggest a sexual relationship between Elaine and her suitors. In this way, sentiment or erotics are as important to the visiting relationship as sexual activity itself. Further, it appears in the last passage that the men feel as though they know Elaine, that her ways and motivations are transparent. They describe her as especially feminine. Elaine has grace, seductive charm, and exuberance of spirit. However, that her suitors are intoxicated when spending time with her suggests that their view of the exchange might be warped. At the start of the story, Tony and Elaine have been separated for a week. However, the narrative moves from the Saturday evening on which it begins to the beginning of Elaine and Tony's relationship the August prior. Nearly a page in this very short story is devoted to their courtship. So like Elaine's other suitors, Tony had treated her to a meal at a local Chinese restaurant. After, however, Tony indicated more serious interest in Elaine by renting a room for her. We do not learn what transpires in their day-to-day relationship because the plot jumps forward again, only that after a time Tony loses interest. Her behavior, according to Tony, is different during courtship and in the routine of a relationship. Quote, "But a year had rolled on, and the irresistible fascination of the Dogla had waned. Tony had grown tired. He thought that the exuberance of spirit he admired in her had all gone. She did not laugh as before. She had grown cold." End quote. While we might assume, following Tony's impressions, that Elaine is simply not as enthusiastic or as desirable as before, we can draw on the description of her dating history to make to come to another conclusion, that the Dogla is not only her racial background, but a kind of persona that she intentionally puts on in order to attract admirers who will provide for her. But in the course of the relationship, this persona or uniform inevitably falls away. After Tony leaves, he becomes involved with another woman, and meanwhile, Elaine seeks other ways to pay her rent, as she had when Tony was out of work. Elaine guesses that another man, Souza, would give her enough to pay the rent. She is confident in the intentions of other men in the community. While Elaine contemplates ways to keep herself housed and fed, an important dance is impending. Another companion, Freddie, has offered to buy a dress for Elaine so that she can attend the dance. However, she is not committed to attending the dance with Freddie, nor is he mentioned again. The dance is a social obligation for each member of the yard, not necessarily an event for which attendees would seek a single date. Quote, "The women would have much to say if she did not attend." End quote. It is one thing to be without a man and his income, it is quite another not to participate in the social affairs of the community. The appearance of strength or survival, to be able to survive under any circumstances, is only just less important to having someone to keep one to ensure that survival. Couture observes that Elaine is unhappy without Tony, but that she could, quote, "always hide it under a veneer of simulated happiness," end quote. And so here, because of the word simulated, it's unclear whether Elaine is unhappy without her lover or without the kind of exchange of companionship for income. Elaine readies herself for the dance methodically, loosening her hair from plaits, combing her hair, dressing herself, and examining her appearance before Souza arrives to accompany her to the dance. Elaine is not beholden to any one man at this moment. Befriending different men allows Elaine to meet different needs without exhausting one man's resources. In this scene, examining the gaze is not straightforward. We see Elaine as she views herself in the mirror, rather through the eyes of her suitors or through the eyes of the narrator. While Elaine does appear to be in love at certain points, her love is not only effective but also a form of work. To ensure Tony's love is to ensure the money she requires for her rent, so to comb her hair and to put on the fitted, quote, brilliant red dress is part of the uniform and persona I've mentioned before. I will skip the description of the dress. At At the dance, Elaine has the desired effect on Tony. The brilliant red of her dress overwhelms him as before, and her appearance literally warps Tony's senses. After Tony separates her from her dance partner, Freddie, there was silence for a moment, and the next day was bright, end quote. Reunited with Tony, Elaine is comfortable again. The lacuna in the quoted sentence, however, points to the dynamic between the two parties. While Tony believes that he has freely chosen and consumed her, the Dogla, Elaine is also consuming his resources, and the kept relationship requires a delicate balance of expectations. So, in conclusion, the Beacon Group short stories appear to speak to a middle-class audience, contrasting working life with bourgeois values. However, reading Triumph in the Dogla through kept relationships allows us to examine the modes of exchange at the heart of the barrack yard. In the decades before the independence period in the British West Indies, the 20th century barrack yard presents the underside not only to formal housing, but also to capitalist labor and respectability. Thank you.